The crystalline spires of Nueva Academia pierced the lavender sky of Centauri Prime, their iridescent surfaces reflecting the light of 3 moons. Inside one of the Academy's orientation halls, Sarah Chen stood before a gathering of alien students, acutely aware that she was the only human in the room. The other students, a diverse collection of species from across known space, watched her with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. As our first human exchange student, announced Director Xalfar, his translucent tentacles rippling with bioluminescent patterns, Cadet Chen represents an important step in galactic cooperation. Earth has only recently joined the Confederation, and we are honored to have one of their finest military academy students join us. Sarah maintained her composure, though she could hear the whispers. The Arcturian students, with their crystalline bodies, were particularly vocal in their doubts. How can they even function without an exoskeleton? One murmured. I heard they break bones just from falling down. Another added. The next few weeks proved challenging. During physical training, the alien instructors constantly adjusted their expectations, assuming Sarah needed special accommodations. Her classmate, Corex, a mantis-like thoraxian, seemed particularly concerned during their first sparring session. Perhaps we should request a safety protocol modification. Corex chittered, mandibles clicking nervously. Your species' lack of natural armor is concerning. Sarah responded by taking a ready stance. Try me first, then we can talk about modifications. What followed left the training hall in stunned silence. Despite Corex's superior strength and natural weapons, Sarah's agility and endurance allowed her to maintain the upper hand. The match ended with Corex yielding, more from exhaustion than defeat. How? Corex asked afterward, body temperature still elevated from exertion. Your vital signs indicated strain, yet you continued without degradation. Sarah wiped sweat from her brow, a concept that fascinated her alien classmates. Humans are persistence predators, she explained. We evolved to keep going long after other species would stop. It's not about being the strongest or having the best natural defenses. It's about outlasting your opponent. The incident sparked intense interest among the xenobiologists at the Academy. They began studying human physiology more closely, particularly fascinated by concepts like runner's high and the human body's ability to repair itself while in motion. During theoretical classes, Sarah found herself becoming something of an impromptu expert on human capabilities. Professor Xylax, a gaseous being contained within an environmental suit, often called on her to explain aspects of human adaptation. Your species lacks almost every major survival advantage, Xylax observed during one lecture. No natural weapons, minimal environmental resistance, relatively weak compared to many spacefaring species. Yet you've survived countless extinction-level events on your homeworld. How? Sarah thought about the long history of human survival, of adaptation and innovation. We're not the strongest, fastest, or most naturally protected species, she acknowledged. But we are incredibly stubborn. Where other species might evolve natural defenses, we learned to make them. When we couldn't outfight something, we learned to outlast it. Every limitation became an opportunity for innovation. The professor's gaseous form swirled thoughtfully. An interesting perspective. Perhaps what we perceive as weaknesses are, in fact, the source of your species' greatest strengths. As the first semester progressed, Sarah's fellow students began to view her differently. The initial skepticism gave way to curiosity, then respect. They noticed how she approached problems differently, how she kept going when others would rest, how she adapted to challenges instead of waiting for accommodations. But none of them yet understood just how far a human could push themselves when necessary. That lesson would come soon enough, during the Academy's notorious survival training exercise on the death world of Nexus VI. As Sarah prepared her gear for the upcoming trial, she couldn't know that she was about to show her alien classmates exactly why humans had survived everything their homeworld had thrown at them. Corex approached her as she packed, mandibles twitching with concern. The environmental briefing for Nexus VI is troubling. Perhaps you should request an alternate assignment. Sarah just smiled, continuing to check her equipment. Trust me, Correx. This is what humans do best. We adapt, we survive, and we help others do the same. Little did any of them know just how prophetic those words would prove to be. Nexus VI's twin suns cast bizarre shadows through the violet canopy of its fungal forest. Sarah Chen stood with her team at the drop zone, watching as her alien classmates adjusted their various environmental suits and protective gear. The air was thick with spores that glowed faintly in the dim light, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that would have been beautiful if it wasn't so deadly. Final equipment check, announced Instructor Vexthor, their arachnid supervisor whose 8 eyes gleamed with bioluminescent warning patterns. This is not a simulation. Nexus VI's ecosystem is actively hostile to most forms of life. Your survival suits are your first and last line of defense. Sarah wore only a standard rebreather and basic environmental monitoring equipment. The spores were toxic, but not immediately lethal to humans, uncomfortable, but manageable. Her relative lack of protection drew concerned looks from her teammates. Crex chittered nervously through his sealed mask. Sarah, the atmospheric toxicity levels here. Within acceptable parameters for human physiology, she finished, checking her nav computer. Our immune systems are pretty robust. We evolved alongside thousands of toxic fungi on Earth. Their mission was deceptively simple. Traverse 50 kilometers of hostile terrain to reach an extraction point, dealing with whatever challenges the planet threw at them. Each team of 4 carried minimal supplies, forcing them to rely on their survival training and each other. The first few hours proved challenging but manageable. Sarah's team, consisting of Curex, a crystalline Arcturian named Xena, and a photosynthetic Chlorosian called Pell, made steady progress through the dense fungal growth. The real trouble started when they reached the caustic swamps. These readings cannot be correct. Xena's crystalline form vibrated with concern. The acidity levels would dissolve standard protection in minutes. Sarah studied the swamp's surface, where bubbles of noxious gas periodically burst. We need to find another way around. This could eat through your crystalline structure, Xena. The alternate route adds 18 hours to our journey, Pell observed, their leaf-like appendages twitching. We risk running out of supplies. Then we'll forage, Sarah said, already scanning the fungal growths around them. These patterns, they're similar to some Earth species. If I'm right, the toxic ones will have specific growth patterns. Her teammates watched in horror as she carefully collected samples, testing them with basic chemical indicators. Sarah, the risk of contamination, Crex began, is acceptable, she interrupted, focused on her work. Humans are generalist omnivores. We can digest a wider variety of substances than most species. Our ancestors survived by figuring out what they could eat through trial and error. Your species tested potentially lethal substances, deliberately. Pell's photoreceptors flickered with disbelief. How do you think we learned which mushrooms were safe to eat? Sarah gave a grim smile. Every human alive is the descendant of someone who got it right. Her expertise proved invaluable as they navigated the longer route. She identified safe water sources and edible fungi, extending their supplies. The alien students began to understand that what they'd initially seen as reckless behavior was actually calculated risk-taking based on deep evolutionary experience. Their progress was steady until the ground literally disappeared beneath them. A fungal shelf collapsed, sending them tumbling into a massive cavity below. Sarah's quick thinking saved Xena from shattering against the cavity floor, though the human's shoulder took the impact instead. Status check, Sarah called out, grimacing as she tested her injured shoulder. Functional, Correx reported, helping Pell up, but Xena's environmental suit is compromised. The crystalline being's protective covering had cracked, exposing them to the caustic atmosphere. Without it, the acidic environment would slowly erode their structure. Sarah quickly assessed their situation. They were trapped in a fungal cave system. One team member was critically vulnerable, and her own injury was a complication they couldn't afford. The extraction point is still 12 kilometers away. Pell noted, their bioluminescence dimming with concern. Xena cannot survive that distance without protection. Sarah was already shrugging off her outer gear. Take my environmental suit, Xena. It'll adapt to your crystalline structure. That's unacceptable, Corex protested. The spore concentration at this depth will make me sick but won't kill me. Sarah finished, helping Xena into the protective gear. Humans have something called an adaptive immune system. The more we're exposed to threats, the better we get at fighting them off. Right now, Xena needs this more than I do. As they made their way through the cave system, Sarah's condition steadily deteriorated. The toxic spores took their toll, causing fever and inflammation, but she refused to slow their pace. Her teammates watched in astonishment as she continued to lead them, navigating by marking bioluminescent fungi patterns, even as her body fought against the hostile environment. Your vital signs are extremely concerning, Corex observed after several hours. Yet you continue to function. How is this possible? Sarah wiped sweat from her face, her voice hoarse but determined. Humans don't have the option to shut down when things get bad. We evolved to push through pain, to keep going when our bodies tell us to stop. It's not about not feeling it. It's about not letting it stop you. As they finally emerged from the cave system, her teammates had gained a new understanding of human resilience. It wasn't about being impervious to damage or naturally protected against threats. It was about the sheer determination to continue despite those threats, to keep moving forward even when every step hurt. The extraction point was now visible on their nav computers, but the worst of their trials still lay ahead. None of them could know that Sarah's display of endurance was just a prelude to what would be required of her before their ordeal was over. The extraction point turned out to be a research outpost nestled within a massive fungal structure. As Sarah's team approached, their relief at completing the journey quickly turned to dread. Emergency lights pulsed through the violet haze, and the facility's external sensors showed signs of serious malfunction. Multiple breaches detected, Corex announced, compound eyes scanning the readouts. The facility's containment systems are failing. Sarah's fever-addled brain pushed through the fog of toxic spore exposure. Are there people inside? Affirmative. Pell confirmed, their photoreceptors processing the electromagnetic signatures. I detect multiple life signs, but they're erratic. Something is very wrong. Before they could formulate a plan, a transmission cut through their comm systems. It was Instructor Vexthor, his usually steady voice tight with urgency. All teams, this is an emergency broadcast. The research facility has suffered a catastrophic containment failure. Their xenomycology lab was studying an aggressive fungal strain. It's breached containment and is rapidly consuming the facility's organic components. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. Most of the facility's infrastructure was biomass-based, grown rather than built. If an aggressive fungus was consuming it, how many people are still inside? 2 research teams and 3 other student groups, Vexthor replied. Evacuation is underway, but the facility's structural integrity is compromised. We're attempting to coordinate rescue efforts, but the fungal growth is blocking standard evacuation routes. Through the facility's transparent sections, they could see the horror unfolding. Aggressive fungal growths spread like living fire, consuming everything in their path. The building's organic components were being devoured and transformed, creating an ever-shifting maze of toxic vegetation. The researchers, Xena's crystalline form vibrated with distress. They're trapped in the lower levels. Their environmental suits won't last long in that concentration of spores. Sarah was already moving toward the emergency access hatch. Corex grabbed her arm with a chitinous claw. You cannot go in there. Your condition is already severe from spore exposure. Without your environmental suit, those researchers don't have time for us to wait for backup, Sarah countered, checking her brother's filters. The human immune system can handle short-term extreme exposure better than prolonged moderate exposure. I've got maybe an hour before serious organ damage sets in. That is not reassuring. Crex's mandibles clicked in agitation. It's not meant to be. Sarah managed a weak smile. It's just math. 1 hour of my time against their lives. Pretty simple equation. Before anyone could stop her, Sarah had the hatch open and was descending into the facility. The interior was a nightmare of twisted organic architecture, with fungal growths pulsing and spreading before her eyes. Her team followed, but their environmental suits slowed them down, forcing Sarah to take point. They found the first group of researchers trapped behind a wall of fungal growth. The organisms had formed a semi-intelligent barrier, responding to movement and attempts to breach it. Sarah's fever-heightened senses noticed something peculiar about its behavior. It's heat-sensitive, she called out, watching the fungus recoil from her elevated body temperature. The fever, it's actually helping. The fungus doesn't like high temperatures. Working quickly despite her deteriorating condition, Sarah helped clear a path for the researchers to escape. Each movement sent waves of pain through her toxin-stressed muscles, but she pushed through it, focusing on the task at hand. Second team is 2 levels down, one of the rescued researchers informed them, but the main access is completely blocked. Sarah studied the facility's layout on her nav computer. There's a maintenance shaft that runs parallel to the main access. It's narrow, but it should bypass the worst of the growth. Those shafts aren't meant for humanoid access, Pell warned, and they're not environmentally sealed. Good thing I'm small for a humanoid and already exposed then. Sarah was already moving toward the access panel. Her hands shook as she worked the controls, but her voice remained steady. Corrects, get these researchers to the surface. Pell, Zena, coordinate with the other teams. I'm going after the second group. The maintenance shaft was a nightmare of twisted metal and organic components, barely wide enough for Sarah to squeeze through. The fungal infection had reached here too, but less extensively. Every few meters brought her into contact with new toxins, her rebreather working overtime to filter the worst of it. Sarah's medical monitor was screaming warnings about her vital signs, but she pushed them to the back of her mind. Humans had evolved as persistence predators, capable of pushing their bodies well beyond normal limits when necessary. Right now, those trapped researchers needed that evolutionary advantage more than she needed her health. The shaft ended at a small access panel. Beyond it, Sarah could hear the panicked breathing of the trapped research team. The fungal growth had almost completely sealed their room, with only a small pocket of breathable air remaining. I hear you in there, Sarah called out, her voice rough from the toxic exposure. I'm going to get you out, but I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say. As she began working to create an escape route, Sarah could feel her body starting to shut down. The multiple toxin exposures, the physical strain, and the extreme stress were pushing her toward organ failure. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while lives still hung in the balance. The fungus had begun to react more aggressively to her presence, perhaps sensing her weakened state. Time was running out, both for her and for the trapped researchers. Sarah knew she had to find a solution fast, but her options were rapidly dwindling. That's when she remembered something from her xenobiology studies, something about the relationship between certain fungal species and electrical fields. It was a desperate theory, but in her current state, desperate was all she had left. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled open the maintenance panel, exposing the facility's power distribution system. Her vision was blurring, but years of military training kept her movements precise. If her theory about the fungus's electrical sensitivity was correct, she might have one chance to save everyone. Listen carefully, she called to the trapped researchers. I'm going to create an electrical surge through the wall sections. The fungus should retract temporarily. When it does, you need to move fast. Through the small opening, she could see 3 figures in environmental suits, huddled in the rapidly shrinking safe zone. One of them, a Medusan with writhing tentacles, responded. Our suits are nearly depleted. We won't survive more than a few minutes of exposure. Then we'll have to do this in one shot. Sarah's fingers worked the power conduits, rerouting energy from emergency systems. Her medical monitor was now flashing red warnings she couldn't ignore. Multiple organ systems were showing signs of critical stress. Crex's voice crackled through her comm. "Sarah, your vital signs are catastrophic. You need immediate medical intervention." "Little busy right now," she grunted, connecting the final circuit. "Besides, humans have this thing called adrenaline. It lets us ignore stuff like organ failure when we need to. Really useful evolutionary trick." The fungal mass pulsed ominously, spreading further into the remaining safe space. Sarah knew she was out of time. With trembling fingers, she initiated the power surge. Electricity arced through the infected sections of wall. The fungus recoiled violently, creating a temporary corridor. "Now," Sarah shouted. "Move." The researchers bolted through the opening. Sarah's vision swam as she maintained the power flow, her body screaming in protest. The fungus was already beginning to adapt, trying to grow around the electrical current. As the last researcher cleared the zone, Sarah's legs buckled. She caught herself against the wall, leaving a bloody handprint. Her body had begun bleeding through her pores, a sign of severe toxic exposure. But she couldn't stop. The fungus was recovering faster than expected, and they still had to reach the surface. "This way," she gasped, staggering toward the emergency stairwell. Her rebreather was failing, filters clogged with fungal spores. Each breath felt like inhaling glass. They were 3 levels up when the facility's structure groaned ominously. The fungal infection had compromised key support systems. The whole complex was beginning to collapse. "We're not going to make it," one of the researchers said, panic evident in their voice. Sarah's world had narrowed to a tunnel of pain and determination. "Yes, you are." She pulled her emergency beacon from her belt and pressed it into the Medusan's hands. "Follow this signal. It leads to the surface team." "What about you?" Sarah was already turning back. "Someone has to make sure this place comes down properly. Can't risk any of these spores reaching the surface." She managed a weak smile. "Besides, humans are really good at surviving things we shouldn't." Before they could protest, she was moving deeper into the facility. Her medical monitor had stopped giving warnings, probably because it could no longer detect stable vital signs. Sarah knew she was dying. Her organs were shutting down, her blood was becoming toxic, and her nervous system was misfiring from extreme stress. But humans hadn't become Earth's dominant species by giving up when their bodies failed. They had learned to push through, to keep moving until the job was done, or they physically couldn't continue. Right now, Sarah needed to make sure this facility and its deadly cargo couldn't threaten anyone else. She reached the central control room, her fingers leaving bloody smears on the console as she initiated the emergency protocols. The fungus had spread everywhere, turning the room into a nightmare of writhing tendrils and pulsing growths. Central core overload initiated. The facility's AI announced. "Containment breach protocols engage. 5 minutes to critical failure." Sarah smiled grimly. The blast would sterilize everything within the facility's perimeter. She turned to leave, but her legs finally gave out. She crashed to the floor, her body no longer responding to commands. That's when she heard it. Movement in the ventilation system. A familiar chittering sound. Crex burst through the vent, his environmental suit covered in fungal residue. "Did you really think we would leave you behind? You shouldn't be here," Sarah managed through blood-flecked lips. "Humans aren't the only ones who can be stubborn." Crex lifted her with surprising gentleness. "Though I must admit, your species has elevated it to an art form." As Crex carried her toward the surface, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. She was vaguely aware of others joining them, Pell and Zena, working together to clear a path. Her team had come back for her, refusing to accept her sacrifice. They emerged from the facility just as the first explosions began. The containment breach protocols would ensure nothing survived in the complex. Sarah's last conscious thought, before the darkness took her, was that she had accomplished her mission. Everyone had made it out alive. Well, almost everyone. She wasn't quite sure about herself yet. Sarah awoke to the soft hum of medical equipment and the familiar antiseptic smell of a hospital. The first thing she noticed was that she could breathe without pain, a definite improvement. The second was that her room was absolutely packed with alien medical personnel, all staring at her with various expressions of fascination. "The subject is conscious," announced a Volari doctor, his feathered crest rippling with excitement. "Remarkable recovery rate, even with regenerative assistance." "I have a name," Sarah croaked, her throat dry. "And could someone please tell me if everyone made it out?" All personnel were successfully evacuated. Corex's familiar voice came from nearby. Her teammate stepped into view, mandibles clicking with what she now recognized as relief. "Though you very nearly proved an exception to that statistic." Sarah tried to sit up, but her body protested. She settled for turning her head to look at Corex. "How long was I out?" "3 standard cycles," another doctor answered, this one a bioluminescent axolotl. "Your condition upon arrival was unprecedented. Multiple organ failure, severe toxic exposure, cellular degradation. By any reasonable medical standard, you should not have survived the evacuation, let alone reached medical care." "Human stubbornness," Sarah muttered. "It's kind of our thing." "It's far more than that," the Volari doctor interjected, bringing up a holographic display of her medical data. "Your species' ability to continue functioning despite catastrophic system failure is nothing short of extraordinary. The hormonal and neurochemical cascades that allowed you to maintain consciousness and motor function in that state. We're still analyzing the data." The door slid open, admitting Director Xalfar himself. The Academy's leader moved to Sarah's bedside, his tentacles displaying patterns she'd never seen before. "Cadet Chen, your actions have caused quite a stir in the xenobiological community, not to mention among our student body. Sir, I apologize for any protocols I might have violated." "Protocols?" Xalfar's tentacles rippled with what might have been amusement. "You saved 11 lives while experiencing toxin exposure that would have immediately incapacitated most known species. The protocols, I think, can wait." Pell and Zena entered next, joining Corex by her bed. The crystalline Arcturian surface sparkled with emotion. "We've been studying the medical logs, the way your body adapted to the toxic exposure, how your systems rerouted resources to maintain essential functions. It's incredible." "That's not the most remarkable part," Corex added. "The fungal samples we recovered showed signs of modification. Your immune system wasn't just fighting the toxins, it was actively adapting to them, developing countermeasures in real time. The researchers you saved have requested permission to study the process," the axolotl doctor noted. "Your species' adaptive immune response could revolutionize our understanding of xenobiological defense mechanisms." Sarah listened to them discuss her biology with a mix of amusement and exhaustion. "You all thought we were fragile," she said quietly, drawing their attention. "Because we break easily, because we bleed, because we lack natural armor or weapons. But that's exactly why we're strong." "Explain," Director Xalfar requested, his tentacles stilling in attention. "Every injury we survive teaches us something. Every time we break, we heal stronger. We don't have biological force fields or reinforced exoskeletons, so we learn to keep going without them. Humans don't survive because we're tough. We survive because we refuse to stop, even when we should." The room fell silent as they considered her words. Finally, Corex spoke. "When we first met, I thought your species' lack of natural defenses was a disadvantage. Now I understand. Your greatest defense is your indomitable will to continue. The ability to endure," Xalfar mused, "not through imperviousness to damage, but through sheer determination to persist despite it. A fascinating evolutionary strategy." In the days that followed, as Sarah recovered, the story of her actions spread through the academy. The alien students who had once viewed humans as physically inferior began to see them in a new light. They started to understand that true strength wasn't always about having the toughest armor or the most powerful natural weapons. A month later, Sarah returned to classes, still moving carefully but fully recovered. She found the dynamics had shifted. Where once there had been skepticism, now there was respect. Her fellow students no longer saw her lack of natural defenses as a weakness. They recognized it as evidence of a different kind of strength. During one cynobiology class, Professor Xilax used her case as a teaching example. The human ability to continue functioning despite severe system damage challenges our traditional understanding of biological resilience. Perhaps we must expand our definition of what constitutes evolutionary advantage. After class, Corex caught up with her in the corridor. "The new survival training groups have been posted," he chittered excitedly. "There's been an unprecedented number of requests to partner with human students." Sarah laughed. "Let me guess. They all want to see the famous human endurance in action." Actually, Corex's mandibles clicked in what she now recognized as his version of a smile. "They want to learn from you. Your example has taught us that there are many forms of strength. Sometimes, the ability to keep going, to adapt and endure, is more valuable than any natural armor." As they walked through the crystalline halls of Nueva Academia, Sarah reflected on how far they'd come. She had arrived as an oddity, the fragile human among naturally armored and weaponized species. She had proven that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in their biological defenses, but in their unrelenting determination to persist, to adapt, to overcome.